Right now, as you are watching this, 340 million European accounts are vanishing from the internet, not frozen, not flagged for review, not buried under an appeal process that might restore them in 6 weeks. Gone. Permanently, irreversibly, completely erased as though 340 million people never logged on, never posted, never existed inside the digital world that has defined daily life for the better part of 2 decades. And the man who ordered it done is not a government. He is not a court. He is not an international body with a mandate and a legal framework and a 40-page enforcement protocol. He is one person. One person who looked at the most powerful regulatory institution on the planet, the institution that had bent Apple to its will, extracted billions from Google, and forced Meta to rebuild its entire data architecture from scratch, and responded to their $20 million fine with 2 words that Ursula von der Leyen had genuinely never prepared to hear from anyone with a corporate address. He said, "I'm done, not I'll fight this in court. Not I'll form a task force and issue a formal response within 90 days. Not I'll pay the fine, issue a statement about our commitment to European users, and quietly comply behind closed doors the way every other technology executive has done since Brussels figured out that market access is the most powerful weapon a regulatory body can hold over a private company." Elon Musk didn't negotiate, he didn't appeal. He walked away from $4.7 billion in annual European revenue, triggered the deletion of an entire continent's worth of accounts, and left Ursula von der Leyen standing in the wreckage of a strategy that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her regulatory legacy. What you are about to understand will permanently change how you think about who actually holds power in the modern world, and why the people who believe they control the infrastructure of civilization sometimes discover, at the worst possible moment, that they were only ever renting it. The story of how Brussels lost this war does not start with the fine. It starts inside a strategy session held 22 months before Musk's announcement, in a building most Europeans have never visited, and a room most of them don't know exists. The 14th floor of the Berlaymont, the glass and steel nerve center of the European Commission in Brussels, is where the continent's regulatory future gets assembled, and in that room, with her most trusted commissioners arranged around a table that has witnessed the architectural planning of every major tech enforcement action of the last decade, Ursula von der Leyen made a declaration that everyone present accepted without serious challenge. Elon Musk was not a management problem, he was not a compliance problem, he was an elimination problem, and the European Commission was going to solve him. The alarm had been building since October 2022, the moment Musk finalized his $44 billion acquisition of Twitter and began transforming it into something that the European regulatory framework had not been designed to accommodate. Within his first week of ownership, Musk had dismissed the majority of the platform's content moderation workforce. Within his first month, accounts that Brussels had explicitly demanded remain permanently deplatformed were back online. Within his first year, he had publicly and repeatedly described the EU's Digital Services Act, the centerpiece of von der Leyen's regulatory architecture, as institutionalized censorship wearing the costume of consumer protection. For an institution that had spent years building the most sophisticated digital governance framework in the history of democratic regulation, watching Musk dismantle its assumptions in real time was not just alarming, it was personal. The European Commission's confidence in its approach to Musk was not irrational. It was built on an extraordinary track record that had given Brussels what looked like a permanent upper hand over every technology company on Earth. Apple had been forced to dismantle and rebuild its App Store policies for European markets after facing fines that would have cost the company tens of billions. Google had paid out more than 8 billion euros across a series of antitrust enforcement actions and had fundamentally restructured the way its search and advertising products operated inside EU borders. Meta had torn down its entire European data collection infrastructure and reconstructed it from zero according to specifications that EU regulators approved line by line. The pattern had an internal logic so consistent that Brussels had essentially turned it into a formula. Apply regulatory pressure publicly, allow the company to resist loudly for a period that generated media attention, and let their shareholders grow nervous. Wait for the legal exposure to reach a level where the board of directors started asking uncomfortable questions. Then watch the company's lawyers request a quiet meeting and begin the months-long process of negotiating a settlement that the company would publicly describe as a victory for free markets while privately agreeing to almost everything Brussels had demanded. It had worked on the largest, most powerful technology companies in the world. There was no analytical reason inside the European Commission's modeling to expect Elon Musk to be different, except that every model Brussels had built was constructed around a fundamental assumption that turned out to be wrong. Every technology executive who had ever sat across the table from a Brussels enforcement team, Tim Cook, Sundar Pichai, Mark Zuckerberg, shared one structural vulnerability: they were custodians, not owners. They ran their companies on behalf of institutional shareholders, pension funds, and board members whose primary obligation was to preserve and grow financial value. When regulatory pressure reached a threshold where non-compliance threatened that value, the people behind the CEO would apply their own pressure in the same direction as Brussels. The CEO didn't need to agree with the EU. The CEO just needed to be accountable to people who cared more about quarterly returns than ideological consistency. Musk had none of those constraints. He owned X outright. There was no board position to override him. There were no institutional shareholders who could file a lawsuit arguing he was destroying company value through irrational stubbornness. There were no financial partners who could threaten to withdraw capital if his decisions cost billions. Every person whose opinion might have moderated his response had either been removed from the equation or had never been part of it. He was, in the most structurally complete sense possible, answerable to nobody. Brussels had built a trap designed to catch a certain kind of executive. Musk was a different species entirely, and while von der Leyen's team was finalizing the most exhaustive enforcement package the Commission had ever assembled, 2,400 pages of documented violations, sworn testimony from 312 researchers, cataloged evidence of 847 specific breaches of the Digital Services Act, Musk was 7 months into executing something that not one of Brussels' planning scenarios had considered. He wasn't preparing a legal defense. He wasn't preparing a negotiating team. He was preparing a disappearing act. The pressure campaign Brussels assembled was built in 3 escalating phases, each designed to make the next level of resistance progressively more financially catastrophic. The first phase was the fine itself, 20 million euros for what the Commission classified as deliberate deception in X's blue verification system, which EU regulators argued had misled European users about the credibility and authenticity of the accounts they were interacting with. The second phase was structural, formal designation of X as a systemic threat to European democratic processes, accompanied by additional financial penalties that could reach 6% of the platform's total global annual revenue if Musk refused to implement the content governance reforms the Commission was demanding. The third phase was the weapon von der Leyen considered undefeatable. Unless Musk agreed to physically install EU-approved content moderators inside X's San Francisco headquarters, not consultants, not advisors, not external reviewers with limited access, but officials carrying genuine enforcement authority with the legal power to remove content, deactivate accounts, and override editorial decisions, X would be simultaneously removed from every app store operating across all 27 EU member states. Not one market, not a subset of countries, every market at once. No European iPhone user could download the app, no European Android user could update it. The platform would functionally cease to exist for 340 million people. Von der Leyen walked her commissioners through Musk's predicted response with the confidence of someone who had run this playbook before. Phase 1: Public explosions. Posts about tyranny, censorship, the death of free speech, maximum noise, maximum headlines, maximum erosion of Musk's credibility with European business partners who value regulatory stability above almost everything else. Phase 2: Quiet outreach. Musk's legal team requesting informal conversations with Commission officials to begin mapping the shape of a possible settlement. Phase 3: Extended technical negotiation. 6 to 9 months of detailed back and forth about the precise scope of moderator authority, the exact calculation of financial penalties, the specific language of compliance commitments. Phase 4: A mutually face-saving announcement in which Musk declared victory for free expression while implementing nearly everything Brussels had demanded. Every simulation produced the same ending. The money would win. It always had. Musk's post appeared at 6 o'clock in the morning, Brussels time on January 2, 2026. Von der Leyen's chief of staff called her personal mobile at 6 minutes past the hour. She was already awake. She had already read the post. She read it 3 more times after that, scanning every sentence with the practiced attention of someone looking for the diplomatic signal, the embedded negotiating position, the veiled invitation to resume talks, the strategic anger that every other technology executive had used as a public performance while keeping a private door open for Brussels to walk through. There was no door. There was no signal. There was no performance concealing a negotiating position beneath it. What Musk had written was not a bargaining chip. It was a termination certificate. And unlike every termination statement Brussels had previously received from an American technology company, this one was already executing in real time while the Commission's crisis team was still assembling in conference rooms. The deletion infrastructure had been designed and tested over 7 months. 3 dedicated operational groups had been activated on December 8th, weeks before the public announcement, because Musk's engineering team had determined that the actual deletion process would require 72 hours to complete and that the irreversible technical work needed to be underway before any public statement created the possibility of legal intervention. At 5:13 in the morning, 47 minutes before Musk's post went live, the first of 14 sequential deletion phases had activated. European accounts were being isolated from the global platform architecture, flagged by IP address, by registered phone number, by linked payment method, then archived in encrypted storage before being permanently removed from X's active database. 340 million accounts, representing years of posts, connections, communities, and conversations, were being erased with a thoroughness designed to leave nothing recoverable. Simultaneously, a second operational group was processing the termination of 4,784 individual advertising contracts with European companies. Automated notices were dispatching in real time. Refunds for campaigns booked through the end of 2026 were being calculated to the cent and processed immediately. The total value of contracts unwinding inside that single 72-hour window was $2.3 billion. Musk's financial team had modeled the full damage with extraordinary precision. $4.7 billion in annual European revenue, gone permanently. Platform valuation, down significantly. Wall Street analyst projections for X's commercial future, immediately and universally downgraded. Musk had read every number in that analysis. He had signed off on it. And then he had proceeded exactly as planned, because none of those numbers had moved his decision by a fraction of a degree in either direction. What had moved his thinking, what he considered the most strategically critical element of the entire operation, was something that no revenue figure could purchase. Within 90 minutes of the announcement, the global conversation had been completely redirected by Musk's framing. Hundreds of millions of people across the United States, across Asia, across Latin America and Africa, were not debating whether Musk had made a responsible corporate decision. They were asking a fundamentally different question. Does any government, elected or appointed, have the right to station officials inside a private company's headquarters with the authority to control what citizens are permitted to say? Brussels had handed Musk the foundation for that question because everything in it was real. The demand for content moderators with enforcement authority was real. The requirement to override editorial decisions was real. The threat to remove X from every European app store, unless Musk surrendered platform control, was real. Musk had not constructed a narrative about regulatory overreach. He had simply made sure the world read the actual documents. Von der Leyen convened an emergency session of the College of Commissioners at 8:30 in the morning, 2.5 hours after the announcement. The meeting was designed to produce a unified institutional response, a coordinated signal to Musk and to the world that Brussels retained the legal authority and the political will to force compliance, that this was not over, that the Commission had tools powerful enough to compel a return to the negotiating table. What it produced instead was something that veteran observers of the European Commission described as unprecedented. Open disagreement among commissioners in the middle of an active crisis, visible enough that it could not be managed or contained before it reached the press. The French commissioner argued for immediate invocation of Emergency Digital Services Act provisions, a court injunction to freeze the deletion protocols while Brussels assembled a legal counteroffensive. The German commissioner, representing a government that had grown progressively more skeptical of von der Leyen's aggressive posture toward American technology companies, argued that the Commission had fundamentally misread Musk's decision-making architecture and that attempting to legally coerce him into restoring European operations would produce a public relations disaster, making Brussels appear authoritarian to its own citizens at a moment when institutional trust across the continent was already fragile. The Italian commissioner said almost nothing. Her silence communicated everything. Her prime minister had publicly sympathized with Musk's criticisms of European content regulation for months. She was not going to defend a policy that Giorgia Meloni had already distanced herself from. The meeting that was meant to present unity revealed fracture lines that Musk's team had specifically anticipated and specifically engineered the announcement to expose. Because Musk understood something about the European Union's structure that von der Leyen had always treated as institutional strength, but was actually its most dangerous vulnerability under pressure. The EU was not a government. It was 27 governments, 27 separate political calculations, 27 separate electorates, 27 separate domestic pressures, held together by consensus processes that function smoothly in slow-moving legal environments and collapse visibly when a crisis becomes a global media spectacle forming public opinion in real time. Hungary celebrated. Italy equivocated in language that read unmistakably as sympathy. Even governments that officially backed the Commission's position found individual politicians rushing to social media to distance themselves from the specific demand for EU-appointed moderators inside a private company's headquarters. The element that was generating the most public outrage, the element that even committed European federalists found genuinely difficult to defend. But the fracturing commission, the collapsing public narrative, the $2.3 billion in terminated contracts, none of that was the development that transformed Brussels' crisis into something that resembled genuine institutional terror. That came 31 hours after the announcement. A single automated signal departed the Starlink Operations Center in Redmond, Washington, and traveled simultaneously to 847 ground stations distributed across the European continent, and in hospitals in Warsaw, on military bases in Estonia, in remote agricultural operations in Portugal, in emergency dispatch centers in Leyen. Screens that had been maintaining connectivity went dark, not slowly, not with warning, instantly and completely. Starlink had been quietly embedded into European critical infrastructure at a depth that nobody inside the Berlaymont building had fully mapped. While Brussels was designing a regulatory framework to control a social media platform, the actual infrastructure that an increasing portion of European essential services depended on had quietly passed into the hands of the same man they had just issued a €20 million fine. Von der Leyen had been focused on what Europeans could say online. She had not fully reckoned with who controlled whether the lights stayed on. The realization that arrived 31 hours into the crisis was not about social media. It was about the fundamental difference between regulatory authority and infrastructure control. Brussels had built an extraordinarily sophisticated system for governing the surface of the digital world: what content appeared, how data moved, what platforms were permitted to do. What it had not governed, what it had not even fully inventoried, was the layer beneath the surface: the physical architecture, the satellites, the ground stations, the connectivity that hospitals and military installations and agricultural operations had adopted because it worked better than the alternatives. Ursula von der Leyen entered this confrontation holding what every analytical framework available to Brussels said were the winning cards: legal authority, institutional backing, regulatory precedent, market leverage, a 2,400-page enforcement file built over 22 months by some of the most sophisticated regulatory minds in the world. What she did not hold, what none of her frameworks had calculated, was the infrastructure. And in the end, in every confrontation between the person who writes the rules and the person who owns the pipes win. 340 million accounts, gone. $4.7 billion, abandoned. 22 months of regulatory construction, rendered irrelevant in 72 hours. And somewhere in Redmond, Washington, 847 ground stations are waiting for the next signal from the one person whose opinion, in the end, was the only one that mattered.